Welcome to Talking Materials Handling. In each episode, you'll hear from the thought leaders who are shaping what happens inside the four walls of the distribution center. We'll cover the gamut, from automation and robots to software and the next gen technologies that are enabling the workforce of tomorrow. This podcast is hosted by Bob Trebilcock, the executive editor of Modern Materials Handling. Remember that Bob welcomes your comments. Now, to today's episode. Well, hello and welcome to today's episode of Talking Materials Handling, the Next Gen DC, What's in the Future for Order Fulfillment. I'm Bob Trebilcock, and joining me today is John Santagate. John is the Vice President of Robotics for Körber Supply Chain. John, welcome.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me here today. I'm happy to have the chance to chat with you once again.
I was going to say, we're glad to have you. And yeah, you and I have been talking about this kind of stuff for probably way too long for both of us. So I'm really looking forward to this one. And this is one in a series of podcasts I'm recording to highlight content from Next Gen 2023, where Körber was a sponsor. And John is on the advisory board. He's participated as a speaker, a panelist, a moderator, I think every year since we've done this in 2019. I'm not sure when this episode is going to post, but it is one of the last podcasts I'm recording before my retirement. When I asked John what he wanted to talk about today, his answer was pretty quick. Let's talk about where we're going, and more importantly, what I'm not going to see after I hang it up. And if you don't know John, well, he's the perfect guy for this conversation since he's been at the forefront of the automation boom, especially in robotics. So, John, let's get started. To kick us off, tell us a little bit about your background and your role at Körber Supply Chain.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Bob. So in my role, obviously, Bob, you're well aware of what I do, but I leverage robotics as a means to solving supply chain challenges in the warehouse. Um, so at Körber Supply Chain, I've got responsibility for our mobile robotics business practice, a practice that I actually joined the organization in 2019 to start. So what we do is we leverage a portfolio of vendor partnerships and align that to our software stack to help organizations address what has historically been some of the most challenging issues in warehouse operations. That being the labor related challenges, especially in order fulfillment arenas. We've seen a great evolution in this industry over the past many years. I know we'll start to talk a little bit about that here throughout the podcast. So what we do is we help our customers, adapt to the modern operating environment with this great modern technology, and look to essentially future proof their businesses. That's where I am today. Prior to this time, I had spent some time with IDC, where I was an industry analyst and one of the very first in the major industry analyst space that was, covering the market for mobile robotics. I've been in this space now, almost 10 years.
It's funny, robotics is in your title, and in a few days, you and I are headed to Atlanta for the Modex event, where I'm told there are going to be like 200 robotics companies represented. So let's keep this first question at a high level, and then we're going to dig a little deeper. Give us a rundown on where we're at in the evolution of robotics in the supply chain, especially in the DCs. As an example, people tend to think that this is new technology, and yet when I look back, I first met the people from Kiva Robotics who kind of, kicked off the AMR craze back around 2004. We're almost 20 years into this, but it really has taken off, since COVID. So, think about where you were 10 years ago when you were covering this for IDC and where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up an interesting point. I think one we can uncover a little bit here around Kiva. But 10 years ago, at the time, I was doing management consulting with a company called Tata, Tata, the Tata Consultancy Organization, where I was really focused on helping organizations overcome, supply chain challenges from a consultancy perspective. And following my time there, had really started to, you know, gain a real interest in modern technologies and what they were doing to change the thinking around how we would deploy technology into the supply chain. If you think back historically, it was always the idea was, you design your process and then you go out there and you find the technology that fits what you're trying to do. And at that point in time, we were at the precipice of some drastic change. There was the emergence of the Internet of Things, the introduction of 3D printing. We were starting to see autonomous driving cars. Robotics was a solution that was deployed broadly, but not so in the supply chain execution arena as much so as it was in manufacturing, right? Robots in manufacturing have been a long-standing technology area, but they hadn't pivoted into the supply chain because a lot of the value creation in supply chain and fulfillment is about movement, right? You're going to hold the inventory in one location until a customer orders it, then you're going to move it to the next location. And at that point in time, 2014 was we were at a phase where I was starting to think we can step back from that idea that define your process, then find the technology and start to look at what technology exists today that didn't exist when I was defining my process, and how would I do it differently today. And so I had an opportunity to join IDC, and interestingly enough, in that process, right, I was asked before joining the organization to write a research report and give a presentation on three technologies that were going to transform the supply chain. And so I had about a week to do this, Bob, and I sat down and said, all right, let's structure this, right. We'll do near term, midterm, and long term, and what's really going to be changing. And so at that point in time, IoT was emerging, and the talk track around connectivity and tying data together was there. So IoT is really that near term play. It's in place today. It's really about how do we piece things together to get value out of connected assets. And then I picked midterm, robotics as the midterm, and leveraged the idea that autonomous driving cars were being developed. The software and the sensors and the technology was being developed for autonomous driving cars that can operate in the dynamic and unstructured world. Why can't that technology translate into the warehouse where there's structure and there's process and apply the same foundation? And so that was my phase two. And then the long term was 3D printing. I think we're still a ways off from that. And during that process, the folks that I met with at IDC said that robotics thing, that's interesting. You're here for manufacturing, supply chain execution, but maybe you should think about the robotics piece and see where it goes. So the first report I wrote, which was in February of 2015, was titled "Robots in Logistics," and it really looked at how is robotic technology being positioned to transform. And so that's back when mobile robots weren't really a thing. And you mentioned Kiva, and that's where it gets interesting because Kiva was acquired by Amazon and privatized in 2012, taken off the market. And at that point in time, as you know, they were the only game in the fulfillment town, right? That was
Right.
who was
Yeah.
there, right? And so Amazon privatized, and it created this vacuum. And so shortly there, I started to write about this area, and about a year later, I saw a modern materials handling article, and on the cover of that edition was the three founders, the Johnson brothers and Bruce Welty of Locus Robotics. And so I said, well, all right, let me pick up the phone and call these guys because they had just come out of stealth, and they invited me to see their warehouse at the time in Devons. It was super early. I don't know if they had customers at that stage or if we were still at pilot phase. And then you started to see less than a year later the emergence of Six Rivers, a company that a lot of the founders were former Kiva executives or Kiva team members. And then you see Fetch Robotics, and then out of India, you've got Gray Orange start to merge, and you've got Geek Plus coming out of China, and you start to see this sort of growth in the space. And so it just, you mentioned Modex. I mean, at ProMat in 2017, there was like three robotics vendors. And in 2019, there was like 30, and Locus had this massive front stage booth. And now this year, you mentioned 200. So the evolution in this space has really created this ecosystem because it's not just the robotic vendors alone, Bob. There's integrators, there's software players that are attaching onto the growth of robotics. So, I think this idea of using robots in the warehouse, to quote a good friend of mine, Rick Falk over at Locus, we're at the bottom of the first inning in terms of the growth here, right? We're seeing this stuff. It's becoming main stage, but we're still really early in the growth trajectory for what can be done in this industry.
I got to tell you. So one, I wrote that article
I know.
on Locus Robotics. And what's interesting is like I didn't know Mike Johnson, but I've known Bruce Welty going back to when he was in the WMS business,
Yeah.
All Points, All Points W or All Points Software, that they sold to I think to EXE. One of those back when there were a whole bunch of WMS systems that were bigger than Manhattan, and I then covered him when he opened Quiet Logistics, and they were one of Kiva's first customers. And kind of out of the blue, I got a call from Bruce who said, why don't you come down to Devon's? And at that time, I lived like 50 miles away from Devon's. He goes, I want to show you what we're working on. And, he said the predicate was that Kiva had just sent this letter out to or
Mhm.
Amazon had sent a letter out to all the Kiva customers that they were going to withdraw support like 2 years in the future. But what it meant was you had to like start figuring out what you were going to do if your processes were designed around Kiva. And, Quiet had created a Kiva driven building.
Yep.
And Bruce had said to me that he didn't want to go with another robotics vendor because, well, what if they get bought by Amazon and get taken off the market? So it was one of those, necessity is the mother of invention kind of things. And at that time, what they had was like a 3,000 square foot area in one of their two buildings where they were running, these robots.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that. Like I'm walking out to my car, and Bruce goes, in a few years, this is going to be a $3 billion industry. And I must tell you, I got in the car thinking, so Bruce must be smoking something behind the warehouse, right? Because all you had were these little AMRs, in a small area. But Bruce was right, number one, in terms of how it was going to take off. But and that led to that article. And then you come to learn 6 or 8 months later that DHL was piloting it, and then DHL, rolled it out. I think as other than Quiet, I think DHL was their first customer, and I was fortunate enough to, that I knew some people at DHL to write about that. But it really was quite an evolution and tied back to Kiva and Kiva taking off the market.
Well, well,
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
Bob. I think you bring up a really interesting point, right, on the genesis of Locus, right? We'll keep going down that path here for a moment.
Yeah.
Um, when you talk about the necessity of it, and one of the things that I felt was always really really valuable was that they took their business, and I remember talking with Bruce, this is similar to you. It's like an unforgettable conversation. He says we took what they were doing and we said, what does our business need that's different from what they're doing, and how do we create something that is better equipped for our 3PL business, right? And that's how they ended up with the platform that they got there. And it was really that, the industry knowledge, because they weren't roboticists, right? They were
Right.
3PL that was using robotics and said, to your point, this is going to be taken away from us. What can we do to mitigate that risk? And they created a product out of their industry domain expertise and pulled in the robotics expertise to help get it over the line there. So yeah, really great story.
The other thing, and then I'll go to the next question. But the other thing that I thought really set them apart, and it goes to exactly what you said, which was they were not roboticists. They were, warehouse and distribution people, and more importantly, Bruce's DNA was WMS systems,
Yeah.
and so they understood the software that they were going to integrate into. And I know it's always more complicated than they say to you, but the point that Bruce kept trying to make when we were going through that is, to the WMS system, the robot's just another person on the floor.
Yeah,
um,
that's right.
and now I know that over time one of the evolutions has been that the robotic execution system, if we want to call it that, has gotten much more sophisticated than if a WMS was directing all the activity. But that was really early days, and the idea that the WMS system could direct the, could direct the activity and optimize the activity the way it would an individual pushing a cart, really impressed me at that time. All right, we're on AMR, so let's stick there for a moment. Um, I just read a post from a venture capitalist, who I know and who's been investing in our space since around 2017. I forget, he might have come back from Manifest, but he'd just come back from an event, and he said that the consensus at that event was AMRs are no longer a breakthrough; they've become mainstream. So, where is the AMR segment of the market today?
It's interesting, and I wonder. I was at Manifest. I was on a panel, and I made that statement. I wonder if we were in the same room at that time. No, I agree. It's almost becoming the technology is almost becoming table stakes. Now that said, I will say, just because you can't automate something doesn't mean that you should. Mobile robotics are excellent in the environments that fit them, but there are certain things you want to look at as a warehouse to determine fitness, right? Is does the volume make sense? Because there's a capital expenditure and there's a return on that investment. And if the volume isn't there, there's other technologies that can help derive value. But I do think 100% that it's a mainstream technology, not in the sense that it's deployed in mass, right? It's a technology that's still going through that market penetration and growth. There's still a lot of upside in this industry, but mainstream in the sense that there's a lot of educated buyers out there, Bob. When I first started this journey at Körber, most of the time we were the first folks talking about mobile robotics. I mean, going back to before I joined Kerber, for those that are listening that aren't familiar with Kerber, we're a WMS company that had acquired High Jump Software. Our High Jump Software has now become our Kerber WMS. And I was joined by way of High Jump, and High Jump was a customer of mine when I was doing my market research with IDC. Um, and so, you know, going back to the mainstream conversation, I'd had the opportunity to speak at their annual user conference, High Jump Elevate, which is now Kerber Elevate, going back to 2017, 2018, 2019. And at that time, when you're having that conversation, when you're talking with someone about mobile robots, it's a high probability it's the first time they're hearing about it, right?
Right.
Today, when I'm talking to somebody, there's an understanding. They've heard about, these different variety of robots, whether it's goods to person or whether it's collaborative in aisle. They're not just hearing about the idea of deploying autonomous mobility into their warehouse. They're now asking the questions of which style is right for us and which vendor is right. And at times they've done, deep diligence across the vendor landscape. And to me, that screams of a market that's you know getting more mature in its growth trajectory because the buyers are aware of the technology, right? We're still seeing growth in the industry itself. The numbers speak for themselves as year over year we're seeing revenue in the industry growth, we're seeing spend increase, and we're seeing those customers that have made the investments previously. You mentioned DHL, they're continuing to invest in this technology because it's providing value, because they're getting the operational savings. And again, like I mentioned previously, we're seeing tangential businesses be built around the idea of robotics in the warehouse. You're seeing software applications that are designed for orchestration and optimization of the solutions or integration layers. You're seeing, as I mentioned, we're an integrator. You're seeing the integrator ecosystem evolve, and you're still seeing new vendors emerge that are seeing what's being done and putting a different spin on it. So there's still, again, a lot of growth, but I think the knowledge and awareness that's out there in the market is driving a more rapid adoption.
You used the word maturity a moment ago, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But first, so we just talked a little bit about AMRs. The second side of that is piece picking robots, and since we've both been around, I remember seeing the first piece picking robot back in 2015. Now that was then IM Robotics. It's now Onward Robotics, and they had a combination of mobile piece picking robot that I saw at a distribution center in Rochester, New York, and it worked flawlessly. And I remember getting in the car thinking, piece picking robots are going to take over the world. That's been a lot slower to develop. So interestingly, I was skeptical about AMRs and I was sold on piece picking, and it seems like I was wrong on both accounts. But what has held piece picking back, and and what will move it forward?
Yeah, so I guess I'll play the other card. I was bullish on AMRs and a little bit more bearish on the piece picking robots. And part of the reason I think there is the mobility piece has been a historical challenge for the warehouse, right? What the people do in the warehouse, 70% of the time or greater is spent pushing something, right? Movement. And the AMRs were targeting that movement to create efficiencies, keep the people doing what they do best, using their eyes and their hands to handle objects, right? That are different in size, shape, configuration, layout, things of that nature. That's we're good creatures at seeing something and doing it, right? You and I, we can pick up a business card, a cell phone, a mug, a 50-gallon pail, all without thinking about it, right? The challenge for the piece picking robot is you've got to program all of the ability to do all of that. We're seeing an evolution and adoption there, and I think that there's a certain scenario and subset of goods to person robotics where we'll start to see an increase in the piece picking attachment and a degree of attach rate to that. But I think the challenge is because the piece picking robots on a mobile platform is really challenging because you're now looking at solving multiple complex problems. Right? When you think back to the EMRs, they were just solving the mobility. Well, you're either going to meet a person at a location and they're going to do all the dexterous activity, and then the robot's just going to move, or you're going to interface with some sort of common standard medium, right? A mobile rack or a tote, and deliver that unit of work to a location where, again, the dexterous work of reaching and grabbing and handing and putting and all those things would be done by a human. So it's really meant to be a collaborative experience. The robotic arms, right, they are not infinite in their ability to reach in the way that a human is, right? We can climb a ladder, reach into an area, climb back down that ladder, and then walk 5, 7, 8 feet, whatever that would be, to put that unit into some other, bucket or tote. The robot's got a fixed degree of mobility, right? A fixed range. You can extend that range, but at a cost. So the ability to get to the point where a fixed arm robot can even just handle the range of movement that is needed is challenging, right? They can bend and manipulate and reach into a space, but if you draw a circle around where that could work, right, it's somewhat constrained to where a human that's infinite, right? And so when I look at why the growth, a lot of it has to do with the physical limitations. They can be overcome, but as I said, it comes at a cost. And so the growth in robotics has targeted that largest, or mobile robotics has targeted that largest waste in the warehouse on non-value added movement of material. So if you've got 100 humans moving things and 70% of their time is spent pushing something, and then you take that 70% of the time and automate it, now you can get the same amount of work done with 30 humans in the process, and allow you to take those others, the other 40, and redeploy them into other areas of the facility, right? With the reaching piece of it, right, it's a smaller problem there. You're so I think a lot of it has to do with the degree of solving that problem. Now, I do think as we move forward and we see more and more installations of, like, the Geek Plus Goods to Person as an example, with some of their tote based structures, you're putting a tote into the same location over and over and over again, and having a human that then picks it and puts it on a put wall. When you're doing that and your items happen to fit the profile of what can efficiently be grabbed by a robotic gripper, right? Now you can start to look at how do you get more creative on the put process, because now the constraint isn't reaching in up, high, down, low, wherever you have to reach to grab that item. You've got a tote that's got a standardized cubic volume and units in it that a robotic arm can very easily reach in and pick. Now the problem then extends to what happens after the put and how do we solve for that. And I think we at Körber are designing solutions that would leverage another type of mobile robot to handle that put to allow you to efficiently utilize that sort of a robotic arm in that sort of a scenario. So, um, if you think back, the question might be, folks would say, well, what about the grippers and the ability to grab? Yeah, that was a challenge too. But we've seen companies invest in solving the grasping problem. Companies like Right Hand Robotics that catalog every single interaction and leverage machine learning and AI to look at, okay, if it's a product that has this configuration in this in this shape and so on and so forth, this is how I need to grip it. So if they fail the first time, it catalogs that and learns better how to handle it the future time. Yeah, that was a problem on the front end, but I think the bigger challenge was in relation to, you've got a robotic arm that is attached to something. So it creates some sort of limitation in range. And I think that it was the range that has held that back. And so as we solve for the ability to reduce the impact of that range, and then we've already created solve the big problem of the mobility, like the non-value added waste, we can start to layer those in to add incremental value.
Well, and I am starting to see, and it's emerging, and there's small projects, but like Geodis in one of its new facilities put in an auto store. I'm my numbers might be a little bit off, but it was like a 30 pick station auto store, and five of the pick stations have a robotic arm. It's single line, it's single line orders, it's certain items, but they're trying to introduce that, but still the bulk of that facility is still, a tote comes to a person and a person picks to a tote.
Yep.
But we are seeing people start to experiment. Let's talk about maturity for a moment. So at Peerless, we do a robotic survey, of all our readers every year, and one of the things we have seen in each of the last surveys is the number of respondents who are using robotics who say they're now looking at other areas in their operations where they can apply, more robots or different robots. And I think back to voice. For years, voice was just in picking, and then as voice got better, people started saying, well, can I leverage this investment and use voice for receiving or for put away or for cycle counting or for packing or whatever? And it's pretty ubiquitous now if somebody's using voice. Um, are we seeing that in robotics where, the people who are using them is still uh, a subset of people running warehouses, and then people who are using them and looking to leverage that into other areas are a subset of that, but we're seeing it as a growing subset.
Yeah, that's Bob. That's an interesting question, right? Because some may know, others may not. But Körber is one of the largest, if not the largest, integrator of voice technologies in the world, as well as AMRs.
Right.
So we do a lot in the voice arena historically. We've made some great acquisitions there. And you're right, right? You target where that high value opportunity is, and then you extend the use of that investment into other areas, right? Like today, what we would have looked at as a voice opportunity, 6 years ago, we may be looking at AMRs first, right? Because they're solving the same challenge but in different ways. One's got a little bit of a higher solution value to it than the other in certain instances, not all. Um, I love voice in things such as preventative maintenance and inspection. Imagine you've got a fleet of vehicles. We've got several customers here that use voice for their fleet management and their fleet maintenance. Right, a vehicle comes in, and now the operator verbally does all the checks and the services. And the reason that's tremendously valuable is several. One is it's not a paperless and get oil and grease on it and you chicken scratch and have to dictate it later on. So you've got real time updates. Also adds value, Bob, because in that circumstance, right, you know how long a particular check is supposed to take within a range, right? If you're checking some particular feature of the vehicle and checking that system supposed to take between 12 and 15 minutes, and your voice check has it executed in a minute, well, it wasn't really done, and you can start to zero back down to qualify the inspection. So yeah, we've seen it really. It started off as a picking solution, but certainly has expanded to receiving and to other areas of the facility. And yeah, we're seeing a couple things. One, like I mentioned, right, there's circumstances where we've got customers that were using voice for the last 10 years, and now we're looking at them and saying, well, you got a lot of great value, but we've got the thing that's next that's going to get you that next level of value with AMRs. And we're starting to see some of that pivot. And in those environments where someone deploys robots for, each picking, collaborative analysis, let's stick with the locus analogy initially, they're looking at it and saying, okay, well, this autonomous mobility is great. I've got so many pallets that come in and, go right into racking on a daily basis. Is that something that can be automated? And the answer is yes. Or we're picking pallets or cases, right? The use case is continuing to expand because it's not about what's being handled. It's about the mobility feature and having a piece of technology that's built for some sort of feature. And the thing that's interesting there is while there are vendors that might have a really, really broad portfolio of solutions, we've seen great the growth of Locust because they very narrowly chose where to compete. Right, with the Locust origin, they said we're going to do e-com order fulfillment, and go back to my early state conversation with them. I was like, "What's next?" And like, there is no next for right now because there's so much opportunity in this space. And now we're seeing them evolve. They made an acquisition of Waypoint Robotics, and now we're seeing new workflows because that's natural business evolution. But yeah, if you look at the picking process, the returns process, dunnage, pallet pick, case pick, I mean, you can look at, how many facilities have gaylords that sit at the end of the aisle that collect trash and, are manually handled, several times per day. Those are all things where once you get that initial investment and value out of the big project, you start to look at what's next and add incremental value. One of the things, though, that I think is interesting is, there is this idea of the ecosystem at play because many of the vendors, handle a very small subset of the processes that have opportunity to deploy mobile robots. So if you're a warehouse, if you're an operator, and you want to do another project, and maybe it's a different type of handling, maybe it's pallets and you were doing eaches, you may need to go out to the market, so you may have another bespoke installation. Well, we at Körber, this is shameless self promotion here, are developing our unified control system to allow an organization to take a heterogeneous fleet or set of tools and put them onto a singular integration layer that does optimization and the workflow orchestration, and then has a singular tie-in to your warehouse management. And the value there is that in lieu of having, vendor A plugged into WMS in one way and vendor B in another way and so on and so forth, you standardize the way those messages are sent back to the WMS to create a more cleaner interaction and the ability to start to look at the lineage of a product's flow through your warehouse from receiving in a full pallet to broken down into a case to handled as an each to out the door. Right, typically those processes are siloed and fragmented and you don't really follow the product journey through a facility, and we want to change that and create an environment where you can look at the materials journey at every step in the warehouse, not by having to log into a dozen different systems to see that, but by having a very unified view of things. So I do agree. I think that as the technology becomes more deployed, we'll start to see more and more use cases emerge and investments. But again, as I said before, just because you can automate something doesn't mean that you should. So it does have to make sense for the business.
The example I use, and they're certainly the exception, not the rule, is the Gap, who didn't do AMRs just because of the way they have designed their warehouses. Um, but they started with Kindred robotic
Yep.
put walls, and have had a lot of success with Kindred robotic put walls. And then and they were doing that for about 5 years. They got expertise with robotics, and then they have started putting exotech to handle their returns.
Mm.
So it's it's not directly related. It's more about inbound than it is order fulfillment. But what they'll do is a return that can be resold goes into Exotech, and if they get an order, for that product, they'll look to Exotech first and integrate that, into the conveyor system that's going to packing. And now they're looking at, I think they've rolled it out. I haven't talked to them for a while, but they're doing Boston Dynamics Stretch for trailer unloading. So it's not so much that they're trying to create a seamless, process like AutoStore to a piece picking robot, but rather looking at processes and saying, is this process one where, robotics, even if it's a different type of robot, can improve the process? And I've found that kind of an interesting evolution on their part.
Mm.
Hey, let me ask you the last robotics question. Look to the future. 5 years from now, this is when I'm, long out to pasture. What do you expect to see in terms of robots in the DC? How's the DC going to look differently from that standpoint?
Yeah, yeah, great question. And you might be out to pressure, but you'll still be in the game, I'm sure of it, in one way or the other, Bob. Um, Yeah, looking out 5 years, I mean, again, look at the trajectory over the last 5 years, right? We go down to 2019, and as I mentioned, right, you have the conversation about mobile robotics, and at that time, I remember using the term AMR in presentations internally, right, in our quarterly business reviews to my own team. And one of my team members came up to me and said, "Hey, you keep using that term AMR. What does that mean?" And that triggered something in me. I said, "Man, I've gotten so used to this term that I use it with impunity, but not everybody knows what it is." So I changed the way I talked about things, that autonomous mobile robots, and then I would use AMR as the message, because it wasn't universally known term. And now you can Google AMR and there's a litany of vendors advertising and articles, and it's become a very commonplace piece of technology. So we've seen um, that growth in awareness. So I think we just talked about what it looks like in 5 years, right? In 5 years, there's more heterogeneous fleets, there's multi-vendor environments, and there's a better alignment of human and machine in the space. I don't think we get to, you know, mass adoption of dark warehouses. That's always a question I get asked is, do you think the dark warehouse is real? And my answer is always yes, it's already real. We can do it today. The question isn't can it be done? Again, the question is should it be done? Because the value to go from an optimized automation environment to a dark warehouse, that might not be worth that squeeze in certain instances, right? But I do think we see continued utilization. I think looking out over 5 years, the next growth lever, really, in my opinion, once we get past the exponential growth in each picking with goods to person and collaborative in our robots, is the autonomous fork vehicles. I haven't ever set foot into a facility that didn't have some use for fork vehicles,
Right.
right? Now, again, this sort of technology, there's a degree of standardization. They can handle what they can handle. They can't handle what they can't handle. They do what they're told. There's physical constraints. Um, but I think, 5 years out, we'll have a much higher uh, distribution of autonomous fork vehicles in facilities. We'll see more and more environments leveraging multi-fleet environments, and we will be better in tune with that digital thread or that digital life cycle of a product through a facility. I think the ecosystem, let's go back to what we talked about Modex, right? 200 robotics vendors in some capacity in the ecosystem at this event. You know, 3 iterations ago, there were three, four, five, maybe, right?
Right.
So
Yep.
the market, I mean, it's going to look very different. We're even seeing companies solving problems differently with like technology, right? Even you look at Dexery as an example. They're using mobile robots and vision systems for autonomous cycle counting in the facility, and they could drive down an aisle, go up 40 feet, and capture every pallet and case that's within its vision from floor to ceiling in one swipe. There'll be a lot more automation, and that brings up a very interesting thing, Bob. I think you know this, but I did a TED talk recently, and right here I've been talking about all the positives. The big question around automation technology is always what's it going to do to the human labor, right?
Right.
The thing that most folks don't realize is that that is one of the hardest industries to staff, right? There's always high turnover, strong degree of temporary jobs and things of that nature that go into this industry. So if you think about warehouse labor utilization, these are jobs that are hard to fill because people don't want the jobs. And I also think back to the potential for economic impact. The jobs are there. There are some folks doing them, and we're automating, those things away. What gets overlooked, again, I'm going to use the term ecosystem again, we're creating new jobs with this technology as well. There's developers, designers, deployment specialists, maintenance managers. I mean, a customer of ours just started a whole new division of robotic maintenance management because of their investment into mobile robots. So you're seeing new opportunities evolve through the proliferation of robotics. I mean, look at the automotive industry. They started deploying robots in the 70s in their manufacturing lines. And ever since then, the amount of automation has increased in that industry, and the amount of employment in that industry has gone up in proportion to the growth of that industry. So, it's interesting to think about the impact of automation and technology in the negative light of what it's supposed to do, and take on tasks that otherwise would be performed by people. But you know 5 years from now, we're going to see a whole different genre of job that exists just for automation technologies in a different way than it does today. They exist today, but it's changing.
John, I'm going to jump ahead. I'm looking at the clock. Ask one last question. It's kind of related to the one we just talked about. This has been a really great conversation on robots, and I think I want to stick to that topic. For a moment, put aside what you're offering today. Is there a technology out there that you're watching, whether it's a different type of robot from AMRs and piece picking, or another technology that might complement what we're doing in the warehouse that you think might have the most impact on the warehouse of the future?
Yeah. Let's and I'm going to pivot away from robots for a little bit to a
Okay.
related technology that I think has broader applicability. And let's talk about artificial intelligence for a moment, Bob.
Okay.
Uh, right now, and I've always said this, today it's programmed intelligence. It's not artificial intelligence. The stuff works in a box, right? You give it some fences, and the technology can find patterns faster than a human doing pattern recognition can. It's really good at that. Um, but artificial intelligence is the big buzz today in warehouse operations technology. We're hearing it across all aspects. How can you improve slotting optimization using AI? Let's see, you throw the data about your demand volumes and what products are being picked, and the patterns of volumes and things of that nature, and these algorithms can solve for that. But can you take that same algorithm and put it out into yard management? Maybe, likely not, unless you tweak it to some degree. But I think if we look broadly at artificial intelligence, you can apply what artificial intelligence can do and its ability to learn and pattern recognize across all aspects of supply chain management, from planning to execution to delivery. And it's embedded in robots, right? The robots today see, sense, and respond to their environment in real time. That's artificial intelligence, right? In a category. It's a category of artificial intelligence. So, I think that fast forward again 5 years. I didn't talk about it. I talked about the automation piece and the jobs impact. But actually, I would wager artificial intelligence over the coming decade will have a broader impact across the warehouse of the future, just given that it's applicable to so many more areas than the robotics pieces.
Let me throw one final idea out on that topic. So earlier this week, I had lunch here in Chicago with the guy that directs the advanced manufacturing practice for EY, and great conversation. His name's Scott Dixon, and one of the things we talked about was AI, and it was a similar question, and AI, like you, was his answer. And he qualified it a little bit in a couple of ways. One, the way you qualified the warehouse, which was to say, look, we're going to have people in manufacturing plants long after you and I are, have left this earth. Um, you can do lights out, but they're really things that people are good at. So, John, there were a couple of really interesting points there that you made in terms of one, people are still going to be important. Sort of two, that AI is here, but three, the future and what it's going to look like is still like a little uncertain. I had lunch this week with a guy named Scott Dixon, who is director for advanced manufacturing at EY, and I'd given him a question similar to yours, like, where are we going? And he made two of those points. He said, AI is certainly going to be the future, and I think will have an awful lot of impact. B, you're never going to get all people out of manufacturing, at least not in our lifetimes. But C, he was talking about, the readiness of a lot of manufacturing to utilize AI. And he was pointing out that, he was in a factory the other day of a company doing about $10 billion a year that didn't have internet connectivity on the floor. They weren't at the Internet of Things stage, let alone the AI stage. And so he was saying, AI is here. We're using it in manufacturing, whether you know it or not. But there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done in order, in terms of readiness, right? In order to really take advantage of it. Do you see the same thing in terms of warehousing and distribution?
Yeah, I guess Bob, I disagree to a bit, and I'd agree to a bit, right? I think the availability of the technology again isn't all the way there, but it's advancing, it's progressing, and I think it will be there sooner than later. But what does there mean, right? I mean, I don't think we'll have general of AI that can just pick something up and learn it on its own. I think there's still going to be programmed components that look at certain processes and add value. The question there was more about buyer readiness, user readiness, and infrastructure readiness. And that's interesting. A facility in today's environment that doesn't have internet connectivity, clearly isn't it has a lot of updating to do. And is that environment in and of itself going to last? Is that user going to be around much longer? Because there's such a rapid pace of evolution in the technology, right? Companies now aren't talking about keeping up with the Joneses. They're talking about leapfrogging and setting the benchmark. And by the time that they do, their competitors are now looking to leapfrog them with what's next because of the pace of this evolution, right? Moore's law and the compounding effect of improvements. Um, so yeah, no, I would argue that those environments that aren't ready to leverage the modern technology are putting themselves at risk of being around much longer because again, we're not talking small scale machine shops, right? A small scale machine shop that's a one person operation might not need all this stuff, but if you're talking about manufacturing or supply chain at scale, you need to be thinking about, as I mentioned, again, going back to what we said earlier, right? How would you redefine your process if the technology that's available today were available when you designed your process? And if that means making changes to your infrastructure, changing the way in which your organization thinks, that's the direction you need to go because the pace of technology evolution is not going to slow down. It's only going to continue to accelerate. So, those companies and businesses that are looking to be at the front of their respective industries, those that aren't moving forward are moving backwards at this stage in the game, would be my opinion.
Well, thank you, John. That's all the time we have today. Again, a special thanks to my guest, John Santagate from Körber Supply Chain. And thank you for joining. I hope you'll be back for our next episode. Finally, be sure to go to nextgensupplychainconference.com. Enter your email address for updates about NextGen 2024. We have a date. We're planning another great event. I believe John will be there for Talking Materials Handling and the NextGen Conference. I'm Bob Trebilcock. And John, thanks again for a great conversation.
Always a pleasure, Bob.
Talking Materials Handling is produced by Modern Materials Handling and Peerless Media. You can find Talking Materials Handling on MMH.com, on iTunes under SC247, or just Google SC 24/7 Podcasts. We're on all the popular podcast platforms. For more information, be sure to visit mmh.com, and we hope you'll join us again for our next episode.